Born in Paris, famed war photographer Jonathan Alpeyrie moved to the United States in the early 90s. He started his career in photography right after high school, working for local Chicago newspapers, and has gone on to work for Getty Images and Polaris. He has published photo essays in Elle magazine, Glamour magazine, the BBC Le Monde, and many other media outlets. Jonathan's career spans over a decade. His work has brought him to over 25 countries. He has covered 13 conflict zones, including in the Middle East and North Africa, the South Caucasus, Europe, North America, and Central Asia. His new book, entitled The Shattered Lens and published by Simon & Schuster, chronicles the time Jonathan was held captive in Syria by Islamist rebels and is now being turned into a feature film. Jonathan is a good friend, someone I often talk politics with, and we are pleased to have him with us today. Welcome, Jonathan. How are you?
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So I want to get right into it. First, tell us a little bit about what got you into war photography in the first place and what it entails.
Everybody has a different reason why they decide to join this kind of business, which is a very taxing kind of career and a life that you decide for yourself in terms of the sacrifice that comes out of it. I remember a good friend of mine described it as, before I started right early in my career, and it's kind of a life of a monk. You know, you have to suffer like everybody else. You have to be in their circumstances that are drastically different from how it is.
And dangerous.
Quite dangerous sometimes, depending on the conflict that you cover. Obviously, Syria was more dangerous than Libya, and Libya was more dangerous than Afghanistan, so on and so forth. As a child, I was always very interested in history, and that was always my main interest. And I read a lot, and I was always thriving to learn more and more about what had happened in the past, especially in European history. And this was a catalyst for me to, when I came to an age where I had to decide, well, what am I going to do with my life? And by the time I was a senior in high school, I knew war was my calling. And I did not want to be a soldier, so the kind of career that would thrust you forward into conflict, photography was a good one. So photography for me was just a medium to take the war aspect of the life that I wanted to have and inject myself in historical events that society create for themselves and people, and war being a main catalyst for that.
So tell me, though, in terms of actually being a war photographer, what exactly do you do when you land in a conflict zone to the point where you are embedded with, whether it's an Islamist rebel group or an army, a state army? How do you get from A to B?
It's a good question. Most of the work that's being done for guys like us before we get on the field and actually pick up a camera and start taking pictures is a whole aspect of making contacts, proper contacts. And fixers, for example, a fixer is someone who gets you around, speaks the language, makes all the introduction. He's kind of a babysitter in some ways. And once you've established proper contacts, and hopefully contacts that you can trust, then you can actually organize your trip, and you go there, and you have enough contacts on the ground that will lead you to an area where there's fighting, whatever you're looking for. If it's civilian casualties or combat, then you decide on the ground what you want to do.
So you were in, what was it, 13 conflict zones,
Yes,
and then you found yourself in Syria because obviously what we're facing now are a lot of conflicts that deal with Islamist terrorist groups throughout the Middle East. And you were captured by rebels. How did that happen? How long were you captured for? How did you survive? How did you get back here to the United States?
So this was my third trip into Syria, and I'd been there twice before, and this time I decided to go to a different front line, which was very active at the time in 2013, which is the Zabadani, Rif Damashq area, not too far from Damascus. In order to go into that part of Syria, you had to go through Lebanon, northern Lebanon, which was much trickier because Hezbollah controls a lot of that border area. So you have to go through them, you know, and then through the Syrian border and then into the combat zone, which was at the time in the Kalamun Mountains, which was held by the rebels. And everybody was going to Aleppo and doing, so I wanted to do something a bit different. I didn't want to immerse myself with everybody else and maybe cover another dark zone of the conflict. So I spent 10 days covering a battle that was going on, mostly government forces, shelling and clashing with rebel forces, using a lot of Hezbollah infantry to support the government, the Syrian government, obviously. And after 10 days, I decided to go to another area, not too far, about 2 hours south, or closer to Zabadani, which was very dangerous. And the rebel force that was supposed to greet me obviously was aware I was coming, and they decided instead to kidnap me to get money for ransom.
What was the name of this rebel force?
They were, I don't remember the name. I try to forget some of these things, but they were the largest force in the area, about 1,000 strong, and a lot of these guys were locals. And so they knew the law of the land very well, the terrain, and for them, it felt like they were protecting their homes in some ways. But when I was kidnapped, and I found out afterwards that there was a lot of guys from al-Nusra that were pouring in order to supplement these forces were being defeated by Hezbollah. It was a much more efficient force.
So you think these were local men who basically had taken up arms, and then potentially al-Nusra had come in and also infiltrated this group. So they were an Islamist group? What were the principles they were guided by?
So they were Islamic, it's true, but you have, as you know, there are different degrees of it. It's not like they were ISIS, otherwise I most likely wouldn't be here today. But they prayed 5 times a day, there no drinking, they followed a very strict regimen in terms of what Islam can propose when it comes to that kind of intensity. And I think when that's very common for any kinds of conflict, you become more of a radical as you go through war, because you see your friend get killed, there's suffering, so you become more hardened. So I think for a lot of these guys, it became much more of a religious affair, but I don't think it was the case in the beginning because that part of Syria was never really an Islamic area. I think Syria was more moderate when it came to that, compared to other parts like Pakistan or Iraq and other parts of the Middle East. And therefore, but I remember they were praying 5 times a day, and they were becoming pretty hardcore. Yeah.
So what was it like being in captivity? They kept you where?
So I spent 3 months, which is actually in some ways a small amount of time compared to other journalists who were kidnapped for 1.5 years, a year, 2 years for some of them. The problem that I had was the military situation was very bad, so we were being attacked constantly. So it's very tricky. You're kidnapped, and at the same time there are bombings constantly. So you're chained up to, at one point I was chained up to a bed for a couple of weeks and blindfolded, and there are bombs dropping 50 yards away, 20 yards away, and there's clashes.
You were there for 3 months.
Yeah.
And then you were finally released.
Yeah.
How? How did that come about?
So from what I can say publicly, it was a Syrian man. It was a businessman, but also in the parliament, so close to Bashar al-Assad's regime. And he wanted to be out of a blacklist that was written by the European Union and the United States of powerful Syrian men who were close to the regime. And if you were on that list, you could not use your international assets. They would freeze your bank accounts, and that was his case. And therefore, he was trying to get out of that list by buying himself a good name by paying a ransom and getting out.
Okay. And so since you have been released, you wrote the book, The Shattered Lens. Yeah. You have been interviewed on major news networks. And you've also been talking a lot about political Islam or Islamism in Europe and what's happening in Europe. You were born and raised in France.
Yes.
Let's start with France. What is going on over there, and what could we potentially learn from France right now?
It's a very good question, because it's true. The European situation is a very good example to what could happen in the United States if you're not careful. Europe has given up a lot of its national identity through the European Union since the 50s, and it's been a very slow process in removing borders. And by removing borders, obviously once people come in mostly from Greece or southern Italy, Sicily, and working their way north, then once they're in the continent, they can just move around and go wherever they want, which is mostly Northern Europe. So you've had, and this has been going on for decades, and Europe now is faced with a reality where the numbers have become so great that
But these are numbers of what? Migrants coming from where? Exactly, from conflict zones?
So recently, since the last big wave, which was 2015, when an estimated about 1 million migrants came in, mostly for Germany's purpose, who needs labor and needs consumers because its demography is collapsing.
Where are they from, though, originally?
So a lot of them, well, that's the big question, because the media, or the technical name is Syrian refugees. But the reality is that they're not from Syria. Overwhelmingly, probably about 80 to 90%, they come from Africa, and black Africa. And so therefore they're not war refugees, they're economic refugees, which is very different under EU law. EU law makes a very distinct difference between these two.
Are they assimilating? I mean, France is liberté, égalité, fraternité. The whole point is you're French before you're whatever your previous nationality or your religion is. So what does the landscape look like? We hear about no-go zones. We hear about anti-Semitic attacks. We hear about politicians pandering, to Islamism. What's going on there?
So the first part of your question is, it's true that France used to assimilate people. And assimilate is what you said means you become French and then you're second to where you come from. So if you come from Algeria, you're French first and Algerian second. It's the only way this could work in order to have a unified nation which functions. And this was given up probably after the 70s, early 70s, when we gave that up, we were saying, well, you are Algerian first, or you're Moroccan first and French second. And obviously the consequences of that are dire, because now you have a very community-based nation where you have entire areas which are called no-go zones in France, and these are numbers that came out by the Secret Service in France, and they made it public. About 350.
350 no-go zones.
Exactly.
There was a time when you had U.S. commentators talking about the no-go zones in France, and they were reprimanded, and they were saying that's absolutely not true. And you're saying it is true. It's
very true. I mean, it's common knowledge in Europe. No one wants to talk about it because it's still kind of a taboo subject, because if you talk about it in Europe, you're being called a racist, a Nazi, all these terrible things, which doesn't make any sense. And 350, but France is not the only problem. Sweden has 55 now, and Sweden is a much smaller nation. They let, since 2015, about 150,000 migrants out of 10 million population. It's a big number. And they do not have a tradition of assimilation the way France has had for the, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s, when the Italians, the Greeks, and the Spaniards were coming in. So they don't know what to do with it. And now you have entire areas which have their own laws. And their own entities.
Assuming a Sharia law zone.
I think this is the goal. I think ultimately it's not happening now, because I think the great strength that Islamic movements have in Europe is patience, which we have forgotten as Europeans, as Westerners. And they understand that, so they play the system against us. And
give me an example. How are they playing the system against
Well, for example, you have a lot of examples in France of a Muslim man bringing his wife, a Muslim woman, to the doctor or to a hospital. She's sick or whatever, she needs to give birth, right? And so 99% of the time, the doctor is a Westerner, a man usually, and sometimes a woman. And the Muslim doesn't want that, because it's against his law to have, for him, a Christian man, touch his wife to give, who's about to give birth. So you have a lot of incidents, doctors getting attacked and all kinds of problems. When you have these kinds of situations, then there will never be an understanding. Things are not going to combine into a proper country where things are going to be unified and we're all going to...
How about the French public? Are they not pushing back against politicians, or do the politicians find it more in their favor to pander to these so-called migrant communities?
So, two things. Number one, if you're France, you don't control anymore. The European Union controls everything. 85% of French laws are decided in Brussels, not in France. So therefore, someone like Macron, he has no power, or very little. So he can say whatever he wants. No one's listening, because behind the EU is Germany. So it's, since you removed borders, then there's not much you can do.
So what accounts then for Europe, and specifically, even the EU Trade Commission, actually turning quite anti-Israel and anti-Semitic? You have the French Trade Commission issuing discriminatory labeling requirements. Belgium just banned shechita, which is ritual slaughter. Some actually say that Belgium did it to harm the Muslim community because they eat halal, and the Jewish community was just harmed as a consequence. But you have, tons of discriminatory policies. You have the Belgian trade union just came out saying that Jews are harvesting Arab children organs. This is classic anti-Semitism. Why are we seeing the resurgence of classic anti-Semitism by European leaders?
It's a very interesting question, and the answer is very simple. Number one, the big catalyst for that issue that you're talking about is the Israel-Palestine conflict. And for a lot of young Muslim men in Europe, this is a struggle, even if it's symbolic, even if you don't actually go out there and fight. This is a struggle that's being kept alive, who keeps these struggles, against one another. And that's number one. And number two, I think, and Belgium is a great example, has 30% of its population of Brussels is now Muslim.
30%?
Yeah, the 25 to 30, it's huge. A lot of Moroccans.
Which would not be a problem if there was a level of assimilation.
Which there are none.
To Western values.
Right, exactly, but there are none whatsoever. So they're afraid. These political figures are afraid. I mean, in France, you had these riots in 2005. You have them regularly now in cities. No one talks about it. It takes one person getting killed by the police, or it takes just anything for these suburbs to rise up and just blow out. So they're very much afraid about that, and I believe that's the main reason why they're publicly going after Israel. But I think between the curtains, the story is quite different.
And they honestly think pandering to this anti-Semitic, anti-Israel narrative is going to somehow quell a mob that's constantly boiling up.
Because these politicians are not courageous politicians. So you're right. If they were courageous, they'd be like, this is not what we should be doing. I think they're just kicking the can down the road. But at the end of the day, the wall will be there. And when it's going to hit, it's going to be very bad. So
if we were to conclude this segment with one message, what is the ultimate message that you have to an American audience, given that you are watching what's happening in Europe? What are the lessons that we can learn here?
I think the whole progressive democratic movement in this country is wrong when they're saying that nationalism leads to fascism. I think that's a very simple understanding of what nationalism actually is, especially in France. For example, any European countries, we have a very long and gruesome history. We've earned the right to be nationalistic. We went through many wars. We've given a lot of blood. A lot of our sons died. I mean, talk about World War I. 1.3 million French soldiers.
Nationalism in Europe, I think, has a much different connotation than it does here in the United States.
Well,
patriotism here in the United States, freedom, democracy, love of the United States, that's one thing. Nationalism in Europe, on the other hand, it has that tinge of fascism because of Europe's recent past, which is why probably it's more easily manipulated and called bad and evil because of the Holocaust and because of World War II.
Right, so you're referring to World War II, which is a significant part of our history, but remember, we have a 15th century history, talking about 13 years. It's significant. I'm not taking away from anything. What I'm saying is, that's why I said this very long historical lineage that we have, which made us who we are, and which are very deep roots. And once you remove that and you try to break them, which is what they're doing, by removing borders, and if you're a nationalist or patriot, you're a fascist, and so on and so forth. It doesn't work because, and you can see actually nationalist movements are rising everywhere.
Right. Ironically, the anti-nationalist movement has created the rise of the far right, almost neo-Nazi aligned, sometimes, yes, absolutely, neo-Nazi aligned parties in Europe. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. Good luck with your book. Good luck with the movie. And you promised me you would invite me on the red carpet to the premiere of your movie.
I will do so.
Right? Okay. Thank you.